Chapter 1. Introduction. The need for risk assessments to support enterprise-wide risk management. Organizations in the public and private sectors depend on information technology and information systems to successfully carry out their missions and business functions. Information systems can include very diverse entities ranging from office networks, financial and personal systems to very specialized systems, for example, industrial or process control systems, weapons systems, telecommunication systems, and environmental control systems. Information systems are subject to serious threats that can have adverse effects on organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation by exploiting both known and unknown vulnerabilities to compromise the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the information being processed, stored, or transmitted by those systems. Threats to information systems can include purposeful attacks, environmental disruptions, human omission errors, and structural failures, and can result in harm to the national and economic security interests of the United States. Therefore, it is imperative that leaders and managers at all levels understand their responsibilities and are held accountable for managing information security risk, that is, the risk associated with the operation and use of information systems that support the missions and business functions of their organizations. Risk assessment is one of the fundamental components of an organizational risk management process as described in NIST Special Publication 800-39. Risk assessments are used to identify, estimate, and prioritize risk to organizational operations, for example, mission, functions, image, and reputation, organizational assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation resulting from the operation and use of information systems. The purpose of risk assessments is to inform decision makers and support risk responses by identifying, first, relevant threats to organizations or threats directed through organizations against other organizations. Second, vulnerabilities both internal and external to organizations. Third, impact, for example, harm to organizations that may occur given the potential for threats exploiting vulnerabilities. And fourth, likelihood the harm will occur. The end result of determination of risk, for example, typically a function of the degree of harm and likelihood of harm occurring. Risk assessments can be conducted at all three tiers in the risk management hierarchy, including Tier 1, organization level, Tier 2, mission and business process level, and Tier 3, information system level. Tiers 1 and 2 organizations use risk assessments to evaluate, for example, systemic information security related risks associated with organizational, governance, and management activities, mission or business processes, enterprise architecture, or the funding of information security programs. At Tier 3, organizations use risk assessments to more effectively support the implementation of the risk management framework, for example, security categorization, security control selection, implementation, and assessment, information system and common control authorization, and security control monitoring. Purpose and applicability. The purpose of Special Publication 800-30 is to provide guidance for conducting risk assessments of federal information systems and organizations, amplifying the guidance in Special Publication 800-39. Risk assessments carried out at all three tiers in the risk management hierarchy are part of an overall risk management process, providing senior leaders and executives with the information needed to determine appropriate courses of action in response to identified risks. In particular, this document provides guidance for carrying out each of the steps in the risk assessment process. For example, preparing for the assessment, conducting the assessment, communicating the results of the assessment, and maintaining the assessment, and how risk assessments and other organizational risk management processes complement and inform each other. Special Publication 800-30 also provides guidance to organizations on identifying specific risk factors to monitor on an ongoing basis so that organizations can determine whether risks have increased to unacceptable levels. For example, exceeding organizational risk tolerance, and different courses of action should be taken. This publication satisfies the requirements of FISMA and meets or exceeds the information security requirements established for executives agencies by the Office of Management and Budget (OMB) in Circular A-130, Appendix 3, Security of Federal Automated Information Resources. The guidelines in this publication are applicable to all federal information systems other than those systems designated as national security systems as defined in 44 U.S.C. Section 3542. Their guidelines have been broadly developed from a technical perspective to complement similar guidelines for national security systems and may be used for such systems with the approval of appropriate federal officials exercising policy authority over such systems. State, local, and tribal governments, as well as private sector organizations, are encouraged to consider using these guidelines as appropriate. Target audience. This publication is intended to serve a diverse group of risk management professionals, including individuals with oversight responsibilities for risk management, for example, heads of agencies, chief executive officers, chief operating officers, risk executives. Individuals with responsibilities for conducting organizational missions or business functions, for example, mission or business owners, information owners, or stewards, authorizing officials. Individuals with responsibilities for acquiring information technology products, services, or information systems, for example, acquisition officials, procurement officers, contracting officers. Individuals with information system or security design, development, and implementation responsibilities, for example, program managers, enterprise architects, information security architects, information system and security engineers, information systems integrators. Individuals with information security oversight, management, and operational responsibilities, for example, chief information officers, senior information security officers, information security managers, information system owners, common control providers, and individuals with information security risk assessment and monitoring responsibilities, for example, system evaluators, penetration testers, security control assessors, risk assessors, independent verifiers or validators, inspectors general, auditors. Related publications. The risk assessment approach described in this publication is supported by a series of security standards and guidelines necessary for managing information security risk. In addition to this publication, the special publications developed by the Joint Task Force Transformation Initiative supporting the Unified Information Security Framework for the federal government include Special Publication 800-39, Managing Information Security Risk, Organizations, Mission, and Information System View. Special Publication 800-37, Guide for Applying the Risk Management Framework to Federal Information Systems, a Security Lifecycle Approach. Special Publication 800-53, Recommended Security Controls for Federal Information Systems and Organizations, and Special Publication 800-53A, Guide for Assessing the Security Controls in Federal Information Systems and Organizations, Building Effective Security Assessment Plans. The concepts and principles associated with the risk assessment processes and approaches contained in this publication and are intended to be similar to and consistent with the processes and approaches described in International Organization for Standardization, ISO, the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC, standards. Extending the concepts and principles of these international standards for the federal government and its contractors and promoting the reuse of risk assessment results reduce the burden on organizations that must conform to ISO, IEC, and NIST standards. Organization of this special publication. The remainder of this special publication is organized as follows. Chapter 2 describes, first, the risk management process and how risk assessments are an integral part of that process. Second, the basic terminology used in conducting risk assessments. And third, how risk assessments can be applied across the organization's risk management tiers, for example, organization level, mission and business process level, and information system level. Chapter 3, describes the process of assessing information security risk, including first, a high-level overview of the risk assessment process. Second, the activities necessary to prepare for a risk assessment. Third, the activities necessary to conduct a risk assessment. Fourth, the activities necessary to communicate risk assessment results and share risk-related information across the organizations. And fifth, the activities necessary to maintain the results of a risk assessment. Supporting dependencies provide additional risk assessment information, including first, general references. Second, a glossary of terms. Third, acronyms. Fourth, threat sources. Fifth, threat events. Sixth, vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. 7. Likelihood of threat event occurrence. 8. Organizational impact. 9. Risk determination. 10. Information risk response. 11. Essential information for risk assessment reports. And 12. A summary of risk assessment tasks. Chapter 2. The fundamentals. Basic concepts associated with risk assessments. This chapter describes the fundamental concepts associated with assessing information security risk within an organization, including first, a high-level overview of the risk management process and the role risk assessments play in that process. Second, the basic concepts that are used in conducting risk assessments. And third, how risk assessments can be applied across the organization's risk management tiers. Risk management process. Risk assessment is a key component of a holistic organization-wide risk management process as defined in NIST Special Publication 800-39, Manage Information Security Risk. Organization mission and information system view. Risk management processes include first, framing risk, second, assessing risk, third, responding to risk, and fourth, monitoring risk. Figure 1 illustrates the 4 steps in the risk management process, including the risk assessment step and the information and communications flows necessary to make the process work effectively. The first component of risk management addresses how organizations frame risk to establish a risk context, that is, describing the environment in which risk-based decisions are made. The purpose of the risk framing component is to produce a risk management strategy that addresses how organizations intend to assess risk, respond to risk, and monitor risk, making explicit and transparent the risk perceptions that organizations routinely use in making both investment and operational decisions. The risk management strategy establishes a foundation for managing risk and delineates the boundaries for risk-based decisions within organizations. The second component of risk management addresses how organizations assess risk within the context of the organizational risk frame. The purpose of the risk assessment components is to identify first, threats to organizations, for example, operations, assets, or individuals, or threats directed through organizations against other organizations of the nation. Second, vulnerabilities internal and external to organizations. Third, the harm, for example, adverse impact that may occur given the potential for threats exploiting vulnerabilities. And fourth, the likelihood that harm will occur. The end result is a determination of risk, for example, typically a function of the degree of harm and likelihood of harm occurring. The third component of risk management addresses how organizations respond to risk once the risk is determined based on the results of risk assessment. The purpose of the risk response component is to provide a consistent organization-wide response to risk in accordance with the organizational risk frame by first, developing alternative courses of function for responding to risk. Second, evaluating the alternative courses of action. Third, determining appropriate courses of action consistent with organizational risk tolerance. And fourth, implementing risk responses based on selected courses of action. The fourth component of risk management addresses how organizations monitor risk over time. The purpose of the risk monitoring components is to first determine the ongoing effectiveness of risk responses consistent with the organizational risk frame. Second, identify risk impacting changes to organizational information systems and the environments in which the systems operate. And third, verify that planned risk responses are implemented and information security requirements derived from the traceability organizational missions or business functions, federal legislation, directives, regulations, policies, standards, and guidelines are satisfied. Risk assessment. This publication focuses on the risk assessment component of risk management, providing a step-by-step process for organizations on, first, how to prepare for risk assessments, second, how to conduct risk assessments, third, how to communicate risk assessment results to key organizational personnel, and fourth, how to maintain the risk assessments over time. Risk assessments are not simply one-time activities that provide permanent and definitive information for decision makers to guide and inform responses to information security risks. Rather, organizations employ risk assessments on an ongoing basis throughout the system development lifecycle and across all of the tiers in the risk management hierarchy. With the frequency of the risk assessments and the resources applied during the assessments commensurate with the expressly defined purpose and scope of the assessments. Risk assessments address the potential adverse impacts to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the economic and national security interests of the United States, arising from the operation and use of information systems and the information processed, stored, and transmitted by those systems. Organizations conduct risk assessments to determine risks that are common to their organization's core missions or business functions, mission of business processes, mission of business segments, common infrastructure support services, or information systems. A risk assessment can support a wide variety of risk-based decisions and activities by organizational officials across all three tiers in the risk management hierarchy, including but not limited to the following: development of an information security architecture, definition of interconnection requirements for information systems, including systems supporting mission or business processes and common infrastructure support services, design of security solutions for information systems and environments of operation, including selection of security controls, information technology products, suppliers or supply chain and contractors, authorization or denial of authorization to operate information systems or to use security controls inherited by those systems, for example, common controls, modification of missions or business functions and or missions or business processes permanently or for a specific time frame, for example, until a newly discovered threat or vulnerability is addressed until a compensation control is replaced. Implementation of security solutions, for example, whether specific information technology products or configurations for those products meet established requirements, and operation and maintenance of security solutions, for example, continuous monitoring strategies and programs ongoing authorizations. Because organizational missions and business functions supporting mission and business processes, information systems, threats, and environments of operation tend to change over time, the validity and usefulness of any risk assessment is bounded in time. Key risk concepts. Risk is a measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened by a potential circumstance or event, and is typically a function of, first, the adverse impacts that would arise if the circumstance or event occurs, and second, the likelihood of occurrence. Information security risks are those risks that arise from the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information or information systems and reflect the potential adverse impacts to organizational operations, for example, missions, functions, image, or reputation, organizational assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. Risk assessment is the process of identifying, estimating, and prioritizing information security risks. Assessing risk requires the careful analysis of threat and vulnerability information to determine the extent to which circumstances or events could adversely impact an organization and the likelihood that such circumstances or events will occur. A risk assessment methodology typically includes, first, a risk assessment process as described in Chapter 3, second, an explicit risk model defining key terms and assessable risk factors and the relationships among the factors, third, an assessment approach, for example, quantitative, qualitative, or semi-qualitative. Specifying the range of values those risk factors can assume during the risk assessment and how combinations of risk factors are identified or analyzed, so that values of those factors can be functionally combined to evaluate risk. Fourth, an analysis approach. For example, threat-oriented, asset or impact-oriented, or vulnerability-oriented, describing how combinations of risk factors are identified, analyzed to ensure adequate coverage of the problem space at a consistent level of detail. Risk assessment methodologies are defined by organizations and are a component of the risk management strategy developed during the risk framing step or the risk management process. Figure 2 illustrates the fundamental components in organizational risk frames and the relationships among those components. Organizations can use a single risk assessment methodology or can employ multiple assessment methodologies, with the selection of a specific methodology dependent on, for example, first, the time frame for investment planning or for planning policy changes. Second, the complexity or maturity of organizational mission or business processes by enterprise architecture segments. Third, the phase of the information systems in a system development lifecycle. Fourth, the criticality or sensitivity of the information and information systems supporting the core organizational missions or business functions. By making explicit the risk model, the assessment approach, and the analysis approach employed and requiring as part of the assessment process rationale for the assessed values of risk factors, organizations can increase the reproducibility and repeatability of risk assessments. Risk models. Risk models define the risk factors to be assessed and the relationship among those factors. Risk factors are characteristics used in risk models as inputs to determining levels of risk in risk assessments. Risk factors are also used extensively in risk communications to highlight what strongly affects the levels of risk in particular situations, circumstances, or contexts. Typical risk factors include threat, vulnerability, impact, likelihood, and predisposing condition. Risk factors can be decomposed into more detailed characteristics. For example, threats decomposed into threat sources and threat events. These definitions are important for organizations to document prior to conducting risk assessments because the assessments rely upon well-defined attributes of threats, vulnerabilities, impact, and other risk factors to effectively determine risk. Threats. A threat is any circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, or the nation through an information systems via unauthorized access, destruction, disclosure, or modification of information, and or denial of service. Threat events are caused by threat sources. A threat source is characterized as, first, the intent and method targeted at the exploitation of vulnerability, or second, a situation and method that may accidentally exploit a vulnerability. In general, types of threat sources include hostile cyber or physical attacks, second, human errors or of omission or commission, third, structural failures of organization-controlled resources, for example, hardware, software, environmental controls, and fourth, natural and man-made disasters, accidents, and failures beyond the control of the organization. Various taxonomies of threat sources have been developed. Some taxonomies of threat sources use the type of adverse impacts as an organizing principle. Multiple threat sources can initiate or cause the same threat event. For example, a provisioning server can be taken offline by a denial of service attack, a deliberate act by a malicious system administrator, an administrative error, a hardware fault, or a power failure. Risk models differ in the degree of detail and complexity with which threat events are identified. When threat events are identified with great specificity, threat scenarios can be modeled, developed, and analyzed. Threat events for cyber or physical attacks are characterized by the tactics, techniques, and procedures (TTPs) employed by adversaries. Understanding adversary-based threat events gives organizations insight into the capabilities associated with certain threat sources. In addition, having greater knowledge about who is carrying out the attacks gives organizations a better understanding of what adversaries desire to gain by the attacks. Knowing the intent and targeting aspects of a potential attack helps organizations narrow the set of threat events that are most relevant to consider. Threat shifting is the response of adversaries to perceived safeguards and/or countermeasures, for example, security controls, in which adversaries change some characteristic of their intent or targeting in order to avoid and/or overcome those safeguards or countermeasures. Threat shifting can occur in one or more domains, including: first, the time domain, for example, a delay in an attack or legal entry to conduct additional surveillance. Second, the target domain, for example, selecting a different target that is not as well protected. Third, the resource domain, for example, adding resources to the attack in order to reduce uncertainty or overcome safeguards and/or countermeasures. The fourth, the attack planning or attack method domain, for example, changing the attack weapon or attack path. Threat shifting is a natural consequence of a dynamic set of interactions between threat sources and types of organizational assets targeted. With more sophisticated threat sources, it also tends to default to the path of least resistance to exploit particular vulnerabilities, and the responses are not always predictable. In addition to the safeguards and/or countermeasures implemented and the impact of a successful exploit of an organizational vulnerability, another influence on threat shifting is the benefit to the attacker. That perceived benefit on the attacker side can also influence how much and when threat shifting occurs. Vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. A vulnerability is a weakness in an information system, system security procedures, internal controls, or implementation that could be exploited by a threat source. Most information system vulnerabilities can be associated with security controls that either have not been applied, either intentionally or unintentionally, or have been applied but retain some weakness. However, it is also important to allow for the possibility of emergent vulnerabilities that can arise naturally over time as organizational missions or business function evolve, environments of operation change, new technologies proliferate, and new threats emerge. In the context of such change, existing security controls may become inadequate and may need to be reassessed for effectiveness. The tendency for security controls to potentially degrade in effectiveness over time reinforces the need to maintain risk assessments during the entire system development lifecycle, and also the importance of continuous monitoring programs to obtain ongoing situational awareness of the organizational security posture. Vulnerabilities are not identified only within information systems. Viewing information systems in a broader context, vulnerabilities can be found in organizational governance structures, for example, the lack of effective risk management strategies and adequate risk framing, poor intra-agency communications, inconsistent decisions about relative priorities of missions or business functions, or misalignment of enterprise architecture to support mission and business activities. Vulnerabilities can also be found in external relationships, for example, dependencies on particular energy sources, supply chains, information technologies, and telecommunications providers. Mission or business processes, for example, poorly defined processes or processes that are not risk aware, and enterprise and information security architectures, for example, poor architectural decisions resulting in lack of diversity or resiliency in organizational information systems. In general, risk materializes as a result of a series of threat events, each of which takes advantage of one or more vulnerabilities. Organizations define threat scenarios to describe how the events caused by a threat source can contribute to or cause harm. Development of threat scenarios is analytically useful, since some vulnerabilities may not be exposed to exploitation unless and until other vulnerabilities have been exploited. Analysis that eliminates how a set of vulnerabilities taken together could be exploited by one or more threat events. Is therefore more useful than the analysis of individual vulnerabilities. In addition, a threat scenario tells a story and hence is useful for risk communication as well as for analysis. In addition to vulnerabilities as described above, organizations also consider predisposing conditions. A predisposing condition is a condition that exists within an organization, a mission, a business process, enterprise architecture, information system, or environment of operation which affects, for example, increases or decreases the likelihood that threat events, once initiated, result in adverse impacts to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, or the nation. Predisposing conditions include, for example, the location of a facility in a hurricane or flood-prone region, increasing the likelihood of exposure to hurricanes or floods, or a standalone information system with no external network connectivity, decreasing the likelihood of exposure to a network-based cyber attack. Vulnerabilities resulting from predisposing conditions that cannot be easily corrected could include, for example, gaps in contingency plans, use of outdated technologies, or weaknesses or deficiencies in information system backup and failover mechanisms. In all cases, these types of vulnerabilities create a predisposition toward threat events having adverse impact on organizations. Vulnerabilities, including those attributed to predisposing conditions, are part of the overall security posture of organizational information systems and environments of operation that can affect the likelihood of occurrence of a threat event.